Hi everyone, look, it's a real pleasure to be back here at a CloudStack conference. For me, it's been a couple of years. I am based in the US, and so it's always a pleasure to be able to come and see so many familiar faces. So the event doesn't kill me, I made sure that this was my first slide, and I was tempted to maybe replicate this for the next 10 slides just to make sure that we all understood we needed to fill in. But in all seriousness, it would be great if you do, because the more information that we have, the more powerful it is for the community, and you're going to see why I say that very shortly. So first of all, just a couple of things about me. If my, there we go, it's actually now working. I've been involved in CloudStack for a very, very long time. So I go back to the cloud.com days, 2010, 2011. It was funny when Guido and I were talking earlier today, and we were kind of reminiscing a little bit about how we both got started in the cloud. And I think our stories are fairly similar. Of we have a problem, how are we going to solve it? Hey, we found this cool project online. Can we use it? Let's turn it into a POC on some old hardware. And then from there, kind of drive things forward. And what was amazing is that for a lot of us, that's how we get started in open source, right? We see a problem and we try and figure out how we're going to solve it. I was the previous VP of Apache CloudStack, along with a lot of other people that are here, and it was a pleasure to serve a few years ago and really try and promote the community as much as possible. I'm the current CTO at a company called United Data Technologies. We're based in Florida, but we work heavily in the southeast of the US. Over to Texas and further up north as well. About 500 employees, privately owned. We're 30 years old this year, actually, which is pretty exciting. And it's been a pleasure working with them through a lot of different technology projects. We started off as a value-added reseller 30 years ago, and it's still part of our business today. But we also have a very large MSP and service provider business. And I came into the company to really start the service provider business 2 years ago, which has been a great opportunity to work again with a lot of fantastic people that I've spent my tech career with, really, in the US. So that's a little bit about me, nothing too exciting. Look, I wanted to start off today by really just talking about the state of the union when it comes to where cloud is right now, right? We've had a lot of really exciting talks where it was actually kind of funny as I was listening to the keynotes yesterday morning from both John and Guido talking about how important it is to talk to the customer, right? And you're going to see that really through my entire presentation today, right? You've got to know what your customers really need. Otherwise, you can't figure out how to provide a service to them. And if you can't figure out how to provide a service to them, guess what? They're not going to give you the money, right? And they're not going to really create new margin opportunities for you. So that's going to be a recurring thing. But kind of going forward here and just looking at what's happening right now in the infrastructure as a service industry, because of course this is really what the base of CloudStack is. A lot of us build additional features on top of that, right? But the base of it is still infrastructure, right? So I mean, as we look today, the fact is that there's huge price compression in this industry, right? I'm sure that we all see it. It's even more challenging when we're seeing the price of RAM go through the roof right now. You're thinking about getting a purchase order out for some new hardware for maybe a new zone or even a new region in your network, and you go, wow, that wasn't what it used to be 3 or 4 weeks ago, and we're having to deal with a lot of gyrations in the hardware market right now. But the fact of the matter is that we are continuing to see very deep price compression. Part of that is just due to a lot of intense competition going on right now. You know, a lot of the big players, they're trying to one-up each other at the moment. But there's a strategy to this, right? They're not just doing this because they love giving up margin, right? No one loves giving up margin. Is there anyone in this room that likes giving up money? No, I didn't think so. Look, these big guys don't either, right? But there's a very clear strategy to what they're doing here, right? One of them is they're trying to one-up each other, right? They're trying to poach each other's customers. If you already have someone in the cloud who's in AWS and you work at Microsoft right now, what are you going to try and do? You're going to try and win those people over. What's the easiest way to walk in the door? We can save you money. But that's not a good long-term play, is it, right? Because that just adds to the price compression, right? Economies of scale, right? Except for the current drama we're seeing in the RAM market, we are seeing, you know, more gains from hardware efficiency, automation efficiency. But the fact of the matter is you think about the market for infrastructure over the last 10, 15 years, the number one message, particularly from the analysts, is you will save money if you put it in the cloud, right? Now that's a big arguable point, right? It really is. But the fact of the matter is when it comes down to customer expectations, they expect to save money, right? So part of the narrative that we see coming from the hyperscalers is, well, look, I mean, you can come into my cloud and you won't have to go and buy a huge ton of hardware, and you're going to magically save a bit of money, right? But the reality is it's actually a bit of a contradiction, because even though we're seeing margin compression right now for the infrastructure service, strangely enough, cloud margins are increasing with the large hyperscalers, right? And that's because they use IaaS as a margin gravity product, right? And what I mean by that is that they're trying to attract you. It's like a big magnet, right? We're going to suck you into our ecosystem, right? And then it's about the upsell, right? They sell PaaS. Just think about Microsoft's game here, right? I mean, how many companies are using Microsoft 365 products today, which can be loosely put in their PaaS / kind of SaaS market? A lot of people are using, right? So once they get you in that ecosystem, then it's very, very hard to rip you out, right? But they need to get other people into the market first, and they can start selling those additional services. We're obviously seeing a lot of AI and ML hype continuing right now. I'm not saying there aren't great use cases for AI. There absolutely are, but you've got to find them, right? But a lot of companies, once again, say, well, you know, we've got to be part of that game. We've got to be able to invest in that. And right now, those services are extraordinarily expensive, right? And then, of course, you've got the typical SaaS plays that we see from many vendors, which might be ERP platforms, or it might be other sales platforms like Salesforce, things like that, right? And the reality is they're extremely sticky, because once you're in, then what happens with a lot of companies, and we were kind of talking about, as Wedo was talking about this in his presentation yesterday, we have a huge brain drain of skilled talent that actually understand the hardware and actually understand how to build the stuff from the layer one up, right? And in some ways, this falls into the large service providers' hands, right? Because who's left to repatriate these products once you've said you don't need these engineers anymore, right? Well, our cost-saving game is we just lay off all these engineers that know this stuff, or we let them retire, and then we put everything in the cloud. And then you figure out that the cloud's not a good fit. What are you going to do? Because you haven't got that talent to bring it back, right? And that's a bit of a play, right? And when you think about, if you're working at a hyperscaler, you're thinking, how do we prevent customer churn, right? How do we prevent people leaving, right? Well, we scare them. We make sure that they're so stuck on certain products that it's just difficult to move, right? So I wanted to go through just for a bit of amusement here, the three big players against the general market, right? So what we're seeing in terms of infrastructure right now is that we're seeing strongly decreasing margin trends for infrastructure overall. And we're seeing from AWS, they have had pretty consistently high margins for their overall cloud products, but they're also the first to market, as we all know, right? So they're kind of still a little bit ahead of the others. Microsoft Azure, once again, their margins are starting to increase pretty strongly, but they're really, I've said here, the bundling expert. They've figured out how to kind of add all these legacy products that they were paying, or people were licensing on-prem. They've brought them back into the cloud now, and that makes them very sticky and allows them to drive additional margin contribution. Google, or GCP, is a little bit different because they were the lagger, which is rather strange when you think about Google, right? Because normally Google is not the laggard in any of these areas. But they were behind the game, and they literally had to buy the business. So if you were to look at an overall revenue and cost trend over the last 10 years, it's only been fairly recently that they are a little bit more at parity with the other two, because they were basically giving away product for quite a number of years to try and catch up. But they have very big pockets, so they were willing to actually invest in that. So as we look at the overall infrastructure market, these numbers are from 24. This is, you can see, I pulled this from Gartner this year. Overall revenues for 24 and just infrastructure as a service overall about 171 billion. But what I want to point out here is that the rest of this revenue here, other than others, is consumed by 5 companies, right? That's kind of pretty striking, right? These are worldwide numbers here, so this isn't local to North America or Europe here. But what we see is that 80% of the market, the top 5 providers, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Alibaba, and Huawei, right? So we're seeing continued increased market penetration from the Chinese here as well, which is it's going to be very interesting as we think about APAC and we think about MEA, right? Because probably the two most under-tapped cloud markets right now are the Middle East, Africa, and APAC, right? So Oceania area all the way down to Australia and New Zealand, right? But what is interesting here is that the other count here is still $30 billion, which is not really a bad amount of money. So let's say that we could get a 0.1% market capture, right? That's 30 million annualized revenue, right? Would anyone here complain if you were able to add 30 million ARR to your business? It's not too bad, right? But this is only part of the overall picture, because if you look at the infrastructure and the PaaS market share, you'll see kind of similar names, but you'll see Azure being a little bit more dominant here because of their Microsoft 365 plays, right? And then you see a little bit from IBM and another Chinese provider, Tencent, down there as well. But in the end, there's still a pretty sizable amount of money on the table, you know, even outside of what the large hyperscalers have today. And if we look at the cloud managed services market, we see also more opportunity here, right? So in 2025, the TAM for this, the total addressable market, is about $153 billion. So these are services and managed services stacked on top of infrastructure as a service, right? And ultimately, this is really where most of us want to be playing, right? Because this is where we actually get to add additional value. So we see significant growth in the MEA and APAC regions here. I think what is interesting here is that the US market is growing, but it's not growing as quickly as the rest because it's already more saturated with a lot of providers doing this today. That's not to say there aren't opportunities in the US, but there are more opportunities here in Europe and MEA and APAC, right? So the reality is that you've got a potential revenue and margin capture here if you target your offerings a little bit more and you try and see what people's challenges are and start to figure out how to solve them. The other thing I wanted to really quickly touch on was private cloud, right? Offering private cloud solutions today, the compounding annual growth rate for this is pretty crazy. I mean, if you had a bank account and you were getting 19.6% annually, would you be pretty happy with that? It's not bad, right? So there is a lot of opportunity as we see here. And over the next 5 years, they're expecting growth of about $385 billion in the overall managed cloud services market, right? So I want to talk a bit about market influences, right? Sorry, wrong slide. That was supposed to be for Instagram. Who are the really big influencers? You know, the one that we see a lot in the US is Gartner, right? And I think all of you probably know who they are, and you probably also know it's a bit of a pay-to-pay kind of game. A lot of hardware providers, like cloud providers, will pay pretty exorbitant amounts of money in order to be featured with Gartner and get in their magic quadrant, right? The only thing I really kind of think is useful with Gartner is this graph they have called the hype cycle. And what the hype cycle really shows, almost a cradle to a grave for different offerings and different products as we look through, in this case, the hype cycle for cloud computing. So you have an innovation trigger. That's when someone says, wow, this is cool. What could we do with it, right? And then you have the marketing hype starts, right? Tons of people put a boatload of money into something, and they get really, really excited about it, and then it gets pushed out by the press. There's a lot of industry groups that pick it up, and that's the peak of inflated expectations. That's when you go, wow, this is incredible, right? And then you start to wonder what the real use cases are, and that's the trough of disillusionment, right? Think about that idea of falling off the end of the cliff, and then finally you get the slope of enlightenment of where you start to find those use cases. I mean, think about AI in these terms of where we are today, right? All the money that's been poured in around AI in particular, and then finally we're kind of starting to get, I think we're in the trough of disillusionment right now, just to be honest, and I think people are starting to figure out the real use cases of where it will really, really make a difference. But we're past the money, the hyping of the product. What I wanted to point out here is that there's a few things that I think they're accurate with and a few things that I think they're miles off base, right? So they talk about private cloud and over here and cloud managed services and cloud migration as being pretty much in the plateau of productivity. Things are great, everything's going well. But if you notice here, over here, repatriating your stuff out of the cloud is marked as being obsolete. How many people here actually think it's obsolete, right? I don't think that's true at all, right? But the reality is that companies like this have wide-reaching impacts on enterprise decision-making, which have wide-reaching impacts on what people will consider buying from us as cloud providers, right? So we need to do a better job of countering some of these positions, because when we're trying to help our customers sell products, they're going to be running up against people involved in Gartner and other organizations, and may not necessarily believe that there's a path that is sustainable, right? So it's very, very important that we think about that long term. But the reality is that pain can drive decision making, right? And we see that a lot with the whole VMware saga over the last few years, right? People hang on for hope, and finally, one day, it's like, you got to be kidding me, I've got to do something about this, right? And that's just because the pain threshold got too high for them, right? The other thing is that billing complexity in the hyperscalers is pretty insane. To the point right now that this is a 2024 figure, $2.4 billion was made by companies helping save customers money who are in the public cloud. $2.4 billion. So I'm sure that a lot of you who either have bought services from a hyperscaler before, or even haven't, you probably get hit up all the time in your email box, I know I do, with, we can help you save tons of money. You know, we can help you optimize your cloud costs. Well, it's a massive market. And the reason it's a massive market is that the hyperscalers try and make it as difficult as possible for you to figure out what you're spending with them, right? It's also hard to determine a true cost basis. So if you're trying to develop a product and you're trying to make a determination of what kind of margin you're going to get at the other end, it's very difficult because you don't really know what you're going to spend until you have something in there at scale, right? And that can be very, very challenging overall. Proprietary services, you know, I'm sure you guys are familiar with some of these, you know, Lambda, DynamoDB, Cloud Spanner, you know, Lambda and DynamoDB are both AWS products, and Cloud Spanner is a Google product. But in the end, they make it hard to move out of those services. And once you get in them, you start to figure out how expensive the stuff really is. And finally, right, it's really impersonal support perspective. It's a pay-to-play kind of game. So if you want really good engineering support, you've got to have a very high commit on your contract, right? Normally tens of thousands and not hundreds of thousands of dollars a month. Or they just won't even service you, right? Then you've got the customer sentiment problem, right? As I call the frenemy problem, because these guys are also competing with your business on a pretty regular basis. If you're an AWS and you happen to be, let's say, a big retailer, like in the States we have Walmart, I'm sure you've heard of them before, tomorrow they're probably going to be selling the same products that you're trying to sell, right? Which can be quite problematic for your marketing. And if you're a software company, you know, selling SaaS services, all the other guys could potentially come up with the same product tomorrow as well. And what are you going to do about it against a huge behemoth who really has control over that market? It's going to be really, really challenging. And last, you know, how are they going to make their decisions? Do they really care about you? Or do they just care about their own bottom line, right? And I think all of us, when we do business with these companies, have to really understand that they don't really care, right? They're there to make dollars. They're there to make revenue. They're there to make margin. And you just happen to be convenient for them at the time. And who knows what could happen tomorrow. So when you think about this from a customer perspective, when you're working with your customers, I know I want a real and committed partner to work with, someone that I can trust. And I'm sure your customers want that out of you as well. So how do you compete with the hyperscalers? Well, I would just say you don't. Don't even try. It's a complete waste of time, right? You've got to find some white space, or you've got to find some way to create a unique product for your customer base that allows you to drive really good revenue and really good margin. And if you do it the right way and you take care of that customer, they're going to be a customer for life, right? Think about vertical focused markets. You know, take a look through your customers and say, well, how many are in the healthcare industry? How many are in, say, the banking industry? Is there something unique that you could develop that would be advantageous for them and they'd be willing to pay more for? And if you think about, say, the banking sector for a second, they care about downtime, right? They're willing to pay more to make sure they're never down. So could you build a different model for them around SLAs that would actually drive more margin contribution for your business, right? As I said before, world-class support. Delight your customers. Make sure that you're there for them, and they're more likely to want to recommend you to others, and they're also more willing to spend more for really great support. You're going to get that additional uplift on margin. And finally, simple billing and packaging can really matter, right? If you think about packaging a product, we often talk about the typical hyperscaler mentality, which is, well, we're just going to charge you per second or per minute for this instance. But think about talking to your customers about what would really work for them. If they're developing a new product, could you create something fairly unique for them that wouldn't be so outside the norm that you could still bill, obviously, through your billing systems, but could you create something that would actually help them be more successful, right? The reality is you don't want to be a want-to-be hyperscaler, right? Because the fact is, unless you dominate your local market and you have potentially regulatory protections, you're just not going to compete. And so it's a great way to lose a lot of investment really, really quickly. As I said before, think about white space. Think about creating a niche. In America, they say niche. I don't know why, but I say niche, right? So if you can create a really unique space to play, then you're going to be able to innovate in that space much farther. And look, I firmly believe there's a lot of margin-rich revenue in the mid-market. The big boys are not caring about millions of dollars. They care about generating billions of dollars, which means that if you are a mid-sized cloud provider that are looking to just sit underneath them a little bit, it's highly unlikely they're going to be able to come into your space if you've developed a really, really good product offering that makes sense for your customers. I really like the term ethnographic study. How many have heard of this before? Right? Well, an ethnographic study is where you go to your customers and you literally just sit down with them and say, tell me about your business, right? What are your challenges? What are you trying to do? Tell me about your roadmap for the next 5 years. What's going well, what's not? It's not about selling, right? It's about going there and truly understanding what their needs could be. And sometimes by talking to a customer about their needs, you can actually discover new challenges that they don't realize they quite have. They might have a general consensus about an issue, but they might not really understand what's causing it. And it can be fantastic for idea iteration, figuring out new ways that you can help them. It's really all about wallet share, right? If you can get in a customer and you can really help them grow, they're going to call you up and you're going to become a trusted advisor, right? They're going to be saying to you, hey, we were thinking about this. What would you guys do? And that gives you an opportunity to be at the decision-making table, right? Which is very, very significant. So, your customers and your partners who are committed to their success, and you need to be that partner, right? I think a lot of you have seen this before, right? Margin over time kind of graph, right? You have market control, you maintain great margin. You then start to get commoditized, and the only way to stop that is to drive more innovation to get you back up to that line that you need to be for the margin contribution, right? But if you control the market and you create that market just for you, you're going to be able to maintain your margin way, way longer than if you're trying to compete with others, right? So how does Apache CloudStack help in this? The reality is that it frees you up to innovate. All of us have been extraordinarily lucky over the last 2.5, 3 days to either meet or spend some time with some folks who are really, really passionate about making a difference in the cloud community. And part of that is working together on new solutions, new ideas, iterating on ideas that we already have, but ultimately trying to create value for our customers, right? Obviously, having cloud eliminates licensing costs if you're in the open source world. You've got all this experience at your fingertips. But the big thing is it puts you in control of your own destiny, right? So you can go home tomorrow and you can choose that little red pill. And you'll wake up tomorrow morning as if nothing ever happened. And you'll be still paying an exorbitant amount of money to one of the big hyperscalers. Or you can choose the blue pill and come and join the open source community at CloudStack and be in control of your own destiny and choose your own cloud reality. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.